was weak. Good morning. It's great to be here. It's always wonderful to gather with God's people. This morning we're continuing our focus on discerning our identity. Who are we as the Cross Timbers Church of Christ? And we're going to continue looking at Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, what we looked at a couple of weeks ago. This morning, if you're able, please stand. Let's make this confession together. Repeat after me. Hear, O Israel. The Lord is our God. The Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Amen. Please be seated. So as we began last week, we looked at the command, the first of these commands, Deuteronomy 6:5. And we set this before us as our guiding text for discerning our identity. And this was the key statement of identity for the Jews and early Christians, and it still is the key statement of identity for the Jews today. And I think there's a lot here in this verse that will help us discern our identity as Cross Timbers. And so last week we looked at the command, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And we saw that with each of these commands in Deuteronomy 6:5, they point us to complementary but distinct ways of loving God. And they point to distinct aspects of our identity as ways of loving God. And last week we saw with love God with all your heart meant that we must discern our passions, discern the care, the concerns that God has placed upon the heart of Cross Timbers that we can pursue with a singular focus and purpose for God's kingdom. And this week, we're going to look at the next of these commands. You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul. Now, as with last week, before we look at the verses going to help us, or verses that are going to help us explore this morning, there's a couple of things we need to clarify here. If you remember, we said love in Deuteronomy and throughout most of the Bible has little to do with one's emotions. Love in Deuteronomy is about covenantal love, covenantal obedience, loyalty. It has little to do with emotions or feelings. So we come to the command, love the Lord your God with all your soul. Here we have a major translation problem. What if I told you you don't have a soul? It might be a bit shocking, right? It's not our purpose this morning to explore all the implications and how this idea of the soul came about. But suffice it to say this morning that the typical idea of a soul as we think of is this separate spiritual entity which we possess apart from our physical bodies is a terrible translation here. The soul as we typically think of it as the spiritual-like entity is actually hardly mentioned in the Bible. It's completely foreign to the biblical author of Deuteronomy. Instead, what we should read here is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your life. The Hebrew word is nephesh. It actually means throat, literally. But what it means for the Hebrews is all your life, all your being, all your essence. Not simply this spiritual entity which we might possess. The Hebrews don't have a concept of this. But it's love the Lord your God with all your life, all your being. And what the Hebrew author is trying to convey is this, is that you should commit your entire life to God. Commit your entire life to loving God. And Paul captures this well in Philippians 1:21. He says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. So what Paul is saying, what Deuteronomy is saying is, you commit your entire life to God. You give your life over to Christ. And you're willing to give your life even to the point of death. And that's how the rabbis and early Christians understood this verse. A commitment even to death. A commitment to be a martyr for God. That you're willing to die for God. And yet, I think that makes the command too easy if we focus on that aspect. Dying for God is the easy part. It's living for God that's hard. Dying for God is the easy part. It's easy for us to sit here in our comfortable building, nice and safe, to say, yeah, I'll die for God. But it's the living for God that's the hard part of this command. Loving God with all your life is more than just the moment of your death. It means includes the part that you're still living and breathing. So loving God with all your life is a commitment of all your life to service of God. So what does loving God with all your life look like? Not just the moment of your death. Now this is a question the early Christians had to face near the end of the first century. What does loving God with all my life look like? What does loving God with all my life when I'm still alive, the part that I'm living, look like? And thankfully, Jesus, and Matthew's recording of it, gives us a passage to focus on. This morning we're going to be looking at Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, typically called the parable of the talents. And I think Matthew has some key insights for us here, what it means to love God with all our life. But as usual, before reading our passage, we have to first set some context. Now, if you read the Gospels, then you know that they're all recordings of the story of Jesus. But if you read them, then you know John's off doing his own thing, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are pretty similar. Let y'all read this for a second. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are pretty similar in their Gospels. Some would say they copied each other. But though they're similar, they all use I had to get it off the screen so you're not distracted by that the rest of the sermon. Though they're similar, they use some of the same material in different ways. They use the same material for different purposes. They each have their own purpose in their gospel. Let's, for example, Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount. What Matthew has of the Sermon on the Mount, Luke has the Sermon on the Plain. And yet they're recording of the same sermon. And what the authors have done is they've taken the key base facts about Jesus' life and they've used it in different ways in their stories to give us information about Jesus, to portray different points to their different audiences. And so they're each writing for a particular purpose. Unless we come to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's writing some 40 to 50 years after the death of Jesus. He's writing in somewhere between 70 and 90 A.D. And the first century is drawn to a close. And the group of Christians that Matthew is writing to are beginning to think, what do we do now? You see, the early Christians thought Jesus was going to return in at most a few years. You see this in Paul's letters. The early Christians thought Jesus was going to come back almost instantly, within their lifetime. But by the time Matthew's writing near the end of the first century, people are beginning to wonder, is he coming back? What do we do? If he's coming back, how long is he going to be? And they begin asking the question, what do we do now that we know we're going to live long, full lives? How do we live for Christ with all our life? How do we live for Christ until Christ returns, since his coming has been delayed? So Matthew's purpose in writing the gospel is to answer these concerns and fears. So Matthew retells the story of Jesus with this purpose in mind. This is why Matthew ends his gospel with the words of Jesus, "Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Matthew's reassuring his readers, using the words of Jesus to reassure his readers that Jesus hasn't abandoned them, that Jesus is still coming, Jesus is still with them. And so Matthew's purpose in the entire gospel is to get the readers to understand, to help them understand what it means to live for God, what it means to love God with all their life. In many ways, this is the key purpose of Matthew's gospel. Now, if you're going to live a long, full life, how do you love God with all your life? And this is clearly seen in the parable of the talents that we're going to look at this morning. If you will, give ear to the word of God. Matthew 25, verse 14. For it is like a man who is about to go on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately the one who received the 5 talents went and traded them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. And after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, "Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me, see, I have gained 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." And the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, "Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." But the one who had received 1 talent came up and said, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, so I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours." But his master answered and said to him, "You wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would receive my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. Throw out the wicked servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, when Matthew tells a parable, when Jesus tells a parable, he's usually telling us something about himself. He's usually telling us something about himself and God and the people he's speaking to. Parables are allegory. And in Matthew's version of the parable, the meaning is clear. Jesus is the master who's going away on a long journey. And the servants are the first century Christian communities that Matthew's writing to. Matthew's repurposed Jesus' parable. And the servants are these first century Christian communities who are beginning to doubt whether Christ is going to return. How do we live for God? And being Christians in the 21st century, also awaiting Christ's return, it's pretty easy for us to find ourselves in the story. We join those first century Christian communities who are beginning to ask the question, what does it mean to love God with all our life? And so first and foremost, this parable is about Christians learning how to love God with all their life while they're still alive, since Christ has been delayed. And Matthew's trying to teach what this looks like to them. Now, there are a couple of things we need to clarify here. First, what is a talent? Now, talent in the ancient world is actually a large sum of money. When I read this parable growing up, I always thought the servant given the one talent was given like a single coin, like a quarter. Maybe for you older generations, you could have done something with a quarter. But growing up in the 90s, you can't do a whole lot with a quarter. So I always wondered, what was he supposed to do with this? But in the ancient world, a talent is actually a large sum of money, over a year's wages. This isn't like bearing a few dollars in the backyard. This is more like bearing a few gold bars in the backyard. So that the servant is only given a single talent isn't a bad thing. It's not that the master doesn't trust the servant. He's still giving him a ton of money to go do something with. It just means that he's given less than the others. So don't perceive the one talent servant as worse or more negative than the 5 talent servant. The talent, even a single talent, is a large sum of money. And also it's important to clarify, often when this parable is preached on and taught, we understand talent in the modern sense. We read verse 15, to one he gave 5, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. And we understand talent in the modern sense of one's individual skill or ability that one has naturally. But that's not Matthew's purpose here. Talents do not refer to one's individual skills or ability. In fact, it's this parable that we get the English word talent from. It's this parable that led to the development of the English word, and that misunderstanding led to that development. But as we said, in the ancient world, talent is actually money. But yet this parable is not about money either. This parable is not about using your money well till Christ returns. That may be a true statement. That may be a true fact, but that's not what Matthew or Jesus is doing with this parable. To understand, first, remember, parables are allegories. And just as in the parable, the master is Jesus, and the servants in the parable are the Christian communities, so the talent in the parable is also an allegory. It's representing something. And to understand what Matthew and Jesus mean by the talent, we must pay special attention to whose talents they are. Look at verses 14 and 15 again. It says, for like a man who goes on a long journey, he called his servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5. So whose talents are they? They're the master's. They're the master's talents. They're God's talents. This is something we often overlook, and this is why this idea of individual skill or ability, that interpretation fails. Because it's not our own skills and abilities, it's God's talents, it's God's gifts that is given to the Christian communities. And so what is talent in the parable? I think if we look at the rest of the parables in Matthew's gospel and look at the context, talent for Matthew is the good news, the gospel. Christ gives the good news to the Christian communities. Christ gives the good news of God, the gospel of Christ, to the different Christian communities to use well until he returns. And each servant, each different Christian community is given the same gift, a talent. Some aren't given shekels, some aren't given talents, they're all given a talent. And they may receive that gift, that gospel, in different ways. Some receive 5, some 2, some 1. And the difference in number here is not a difference in gift. There's only one gospel. They all receive the one gift, the gospel of God. But they're given different ways of using the gospel. They're given different measures of the gospel. To put it another way, they're given different ways of spreading the gospel. Different communities, different churches represented by the different servants in the parable. They're all given the same gift, but some possess different ways of using it. Different gifts for using God's gospel until he returns. So it doesn't matter whether your church is the 5-talent servant or the 1-talent servant. You're each given the same gospel to spread the good news. You're each given the same task. What matters is that you're a good steward of God's gospel, that you use God's gospel well, and you use the gift that God has given you well. The only way you can fail to use the gospel of God well is to bury it and put it in the ground. And if the 5-talent servant had buried his 5 talents, he would have the same fate as the 1-talent servant. So it doesn't matter what level of gifting, in what way you're gifted with the gospel. And that's what Matthew is, I think, trying to tell these first-century Christians, is that to love God with all your life, beyond just the moment of your death, to love God with all the life, the part that you're still living, means that you use the gifts God has given your community to spread the gospel. Use the gifts whatever way God has gifted you to spread the gospel, you better do that well. Now, some Christian communities may have 5 talents. They may be gifted with many ways of spreading the gospel. They may have political connections, overseas connections. They may have a ton of financial resources. They may have many ways of spreading the gospel, and they better use all those ways well. But some churches, maybe the 1-talent churches, the smaller communities, may be only gifted with one way of spreading the gospel. Providing a welcoming weekly worship service to their community to spread the gospel to their town. Maybe it's hosting a baby shower for a pregnancy care center. And their way of spreading the gospel is supporting new mothers and children. But whatever way the church is gifted to spread the gospel, they better use it well. And if they do use their gift well, then the master will say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." So I think this gives us a fuller understanding of Matthew's gospel, or Matthew's parable, or use of Jesus' parable. That if you want to love God with all your life, it means using the gifts, using the ways that God has gifted your community to spread God's gospel well, to use God's talents well, to invest the gospel of God in your community. And thus, Matthew says the parable to us. He says to us, living in the 21st century, our Master, our Lord Jesus, has gone on a long journey. And he's called his servant Cross Timbers to come to him, and he's entrusted us with his talent. He's entrusted us with the good news of his grace, his love, and his mercy. And he wants us to invest that talent into Stephenville, to use the talent he has given us well to reach Stephenville. And so this morning, the charge given to us as Cross Timbers is to discern our gift, discern the way in which God has equipped us to use his talent, discern the way in which God has equipped us to spread his good news to Stephenville. And once we discern that gift, once we discern the way that God has equipped us to invest his gospel, then we better use it well. And so this morning, let's discern our gift. Let us invest the talent of God in our community. Let's be faithful servants and stewards of God's gift, of the good news of God, and let's love God with all our heart. Together we stand and sing.